Welcome to the Rig Doctor podcast. I'm your host, Mason Marangella, aka the Rig Doctor, and today I'm teaming up again with my good friend Tony Lowe, a guitar expert and tone hound just like you and me, and we're continuing our conversation about the Pedal movie, a latest release from Reverb, sponsored by a couple of other producers of the film, including Jim Dunlop and some other companies in our music industry arena. We're going to continue our conversation today. We kind of left off right around kind of the early boutique boom in the 1990s and kind of on the heels of the rack era of the 80s and early 90s and kind of making that transition into maybe more millennial-based companies and beyond. So we're going to continue kind of with that era in mind. We might jump around a little bit here and there, but for the most part, we're kind of focusing on the second half of the movie, its assets, its drawbacks, things that we appreciated, companies that maybe were overlooked, and we're going to get into it. And again, if you're interested in checking out the movie, we definitely recommend that you watch it. It is a very interesting film, and I think it's great that there's something this well produced in our kind of section of the music industry, in particular with pedals. So I'm glad for its existence, and I hope that you'll enjoy it as much as we did and maybe have these conversations or share with us some of your thoughts that you have based on the conversation that we're synthesizing or your own opinions on it. We'd love to hear from you in any of the social media outlets. You can always tag at Vertex Effects, and we'd love to hear from you about it. And if you want to support this episode, you can do so by sharing it on social media or subscribing to our podcast and just blasting it out on Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube. These are all places that probably both of us exist and that can help spread the word if you think that your friends might enjoy the same content that we're talking about. You can also support us financially by purchasing, of course, one of the Vertex products over on our website or from an authorized dealer. Or if you're interested in more kind of tutorial-based coaching, we have a Patreon page that's designed for just that, as well as private coaching over on the rigdr.com. We have memberships as low as $4.99 a month, and that gives you exclusive access to live Q&As and exclusive deals and discounts on Vertex products, and even sometimes some early access to new Vertex products so you can get them before anybody else. So definitely check all those options out. And if you're not sure if you can afford any of our membership options, you can actually request a free account, and we give 100% free accounts to every single person that requests a free account. So there's no means testing. Nothing is required to demonstrate that you're worthy of a free account. All you need to do is ask, and we give it to you. That's all it takes. So it's very easy, and we don't want money to stand between you and access to this information. So please don't be bashful. We are happy to grant you a free account. And from the membership side, there's no differentiation between who has a paid versus free account. Only one person knows that, which is the person that's managing our website. Everybody else thinks that it's just the same account that anybody else would have. So it's completely anonymous. So again, we have no requirements for those that wish to have a free account. All you need to do is ask. It's all anonymized. So please join us. We'd love to have you be a part of the conversation. And all we ask is if your financial circumstance change, that you become a supporting member at that time. Before we get into it, I also want to thank all of our sponsors, Blue Microphones, Diodario, True Tone, and of course, Vertex Effects. Without the sponsorship of these different companies, our podcast wouldn't be what it is. Blue has been a great sponsor since the beginning, providing all of our microphones. Diodario provides us giveaway items for our live streams that we do every single week in our private live streams. And so does True Tone, and then of course Vertex, my company. We're the ones that are providing the major financial support for the operations and the salaries and people to edit and mix and all these things of the podcast. So thank you to all those for making it possible. And without further delay, let's get into part 2 of the Pedal movie. So we're resuming on part 2 of our discussion of the Pedal movie.
Yes.
And just since some time has passed since our first conversation, let's kind of recap. I remember we talked about sort of the history of some of the iconic early pedals, kind of back with the Maestro, and then moving through Fuzz Face, Octavia, Big Muff, Wah, Mutron, Unifibe, MXR kind of being the big, in Boss kind of being the two big commercial entities that weren't kind of singular pedal sort of operations, and got into the rack era. And then we were kind of where we left off with was kind of the first wave boutique stuff. So we were talking about Full Tone, Way Huge, Prescription Electronics.
Yeah.
And kind of where they fit in. Sans Amp was also the pedal movie kind of puts them in that conversation. Although I don't know that, even though that may be true, I don't know that I identified with them the same way as I did a Prescription Electronics or a Way Huge or a Full Tone.
No, I think they were cool. They were kind of the precursor to the Line 6 thing. My experience of them was that they intended to provide a direct solution for, you don't have an amplifier, so you use this instead, or it sounds like different amplifiers. It was just analog.
I thought that the thing that Sans Amp and I think Tech 21, I think that they're interrelated is my recollection. Could be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure that they're intertwined in some way.
Yeah, they're the same.
They were kind of the original Amp in the Box guys, because even before kind of guys like, and I think Brian Wampler says this explicitly in the movie, that he became known as the Amp in the Box kind of guy. I think that Tech 21 was doing Amp in a Box style effects really pretty early on. They were doing those tweed and blackface and Vox, and they would kind of like screen print like a grill cloth that would sort of resemble the font and look of those amps.
Yeah, well, but Mason, the Tech 21 was the brand, and Sans Amp was their original product. And so they had a Sans Amp, and it had all these little dip switches on it, and you would kind of dial it in to be like an amp. But it was kind of complicated. It didn't have a lot of output. It was meant as a direct recording device. It's something that the producer Chad Blake to this day runs all kinds of instruments through one to get unique sounds. It has an outboard device. They had a rack version of the Sans Amp, and it was a huge thing. The guitar player Joe Gore used one on a lot of sessions, and it was a cool way to record direct. It was meant to be like an amp simulation that's analog, but it was kind of a lot of little dip switches. It didn't look like other things on the market, and so Tech 21 then started to do other brandings where they would just pre-dial in a singular voice and offer that as a pedal, that's the series that you're referring to that came later.
Some of them sound really great. In fact, I mean, there's other pedals out now since I've done this test, but with Henry Kaiser, he really loved the Vox versions of what they did, and he swore by that pedal as like the best Vox in the box. Another company that I didn't hear a lot about in here, though, that I thought was kind of somewhere in between the first and second wave was Menatone. Had a lot of really cool amp in the box type effects that kind of predated a lot of the companies that were mentioned here. I thought that they kind of had some cool stuff.
Yeah, they also were one of the first to do the Dumble sound in a box, right? Like they were going
right. It was called like the Howie or something like that.
Howie. I remember they had the King of the Britons.
Yeah, that was a hot one.
Yeah, I remember those.
Yeah.
Let me think. Did they make the?
They had a top boost in a can, which was just like a Voxy thing.
Didn't they make the Red Snapper or something?
They did.
Yeah.
That was kind of like their Tube Screamer style.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir. I remember those pedals.
They were really nice. And was there any other boutique companies that you thought during this era, like that early 90s first wave, that you thought didn't get mentioned here that was maybe more prominent than, or maybe deserved talking about?
Not really, because they got into Analog Man a bit, right? Do I remember that right?
They got into him a little bit, but I saw him as being more of a spokesperson of or a narrator of an era more than, I felt like Keeley was maybe more emphasized than Analog Man in that regard. But Analog Man and Robert Keeley were kind of doing the same thing for a long time. Like I remember, if you go to a guitar show, you would likely see Analog. Like if it was a prominent vintage guitar show, you would probably see Analog Man there, and you'd probably also see Robert Keeley there, because they were kind of the guys that were doing pedal mods. You probably saw more Robert Keeley where you were, because Toledo, Ohio is not. I mean, it's not close, but it's certainly closer to Oklahoma City or wherever. Robert Keeley's kind of near Oklahoma City.
I mean, I guess it's. I don't know that it's closer. Where's Analog Man? Isn't he in New York?
He's in Connecticut.
Yeah, I'm closer to Connecticut than Oklahoma.
Well, there you have it.
But I think, watch, there will be some like geography buff that'll be like, nope. I don't know. No, I'm pretty far east. But the point is, I remember Analog Man from the back of the vintage guitar magazines. There was this kind of hand-drawn tube screamer, and it talked about the 808 and that it's different. I remember when that was a new idea. The TS-808 is different from the TS-9. And the TS-9 wasn't a vintage pedal yet. I mean, it was in terms of that anything from the 80s can be vintage. It was almost as old. But what I mean is, in the market, there wasn't demand for the TS9 of any sort until the 808s ran out, and then people wanted the early TS9, and then those ran out, and then people wanted a TS10, and it just goes on and on. And but I remember Analog Man and Robert Keeley were both guys who started out as like kind of they were just mod guys running a small operation, and Analog Man kept that funky one guy vibe for his company. Robert Keeley went into production, and that's why Robert Keeley is kind of he's seen as the big guy, because his pedals are like at Guitar Center and stuff.
Yeah, and I think his circumstance was also kind of a little bit different, because Robert Keeley, and I could be wrong on this, but I think that Robert Keeley had options where you could buy his pre-modded pedals from a dealership, or you could send your pedals in to be modified to his specification. And I think that a lot of his business was more on purchasing Boss pedals from Boss as a wholesale dealer, making the modifications, and then you could buy a Keeley modded DS1 or a Keeley modded TR2 or a Keeley modded Tube Screamer, and you could buy them from a dealership. And when Boss decided that they didn't want to supply him anymore, it cut off a big part of what his business was. Now, I'm sort of guesstimating a little bit here on some of the things that are the sequence of events and exactly how it happened, but my understanding from people that work at Boss, who I know that disagreed with this decision, and people that know Robert Keeley, and I know Robert a little bit, basically they said, we want to introduce our own boutique versions of our own pedals that incorporate some of these modifications with the Wazacraft stuff. It wasn't called that, of course, at the time.
Right.
But a lot of those Waza pedals are incorporating modifications that Keeley developed for the boutique market 10 years before Boss ever released Wazacraft, maybe even more. And so because he could no longer buy from Boss anymore, I think he was forced into having to come out with even a greater number of pedals, because there was kind of a demarcation from when Keeley still did mods. And now I don't think that they do mods at all. I don't think you can even send a pedal in to have a Keeley fat mod tube or whatever it is, fat mod blues driver. I think you just buy his pedal that's sort of a blues driver circuit with his tweaks already incorporated to it. And so his style changed, whereas Analog Man, I mean, I remember this being in high school, that I sent him a Tube Screamer, a TS9, to modify, because I saw that like Kenny Wayne Shepherd had pedals made by him,
and you
modded by him.
You wanted to sound like
and I
Kenny.
wanted to sound like BB Ray Shepherd.
Did you get the KWS mod with the gaffer's tape already on it? and marked?
I did. I doubt it exactly like how. Well, that came later. That came later. I think when Kenny Wayne was more of an established Analog Man user. I think this was before it. I think it was just whatever mod he offered to the TS9s. So, yeah, that came later. But this was an earlier interpretation. But I remember you had to go and get a postal money order, and you had to put it in the battery compartment.
Yeah.
And and that's how you would pay for your modification. Like, it was really primitive,
Yep,
and
I
you would
sent
mail
him
it to Connecticut. Yeah. So it was a different vibe, but you can still do, maybe he doesn't do postal money orders in the battery compartment anymore, but you can still send Analog Man a pedal to mod is my understanding.
Yeah, that's that little kitchen vibe I was talking about. And I think the magic word, if there's a difference, and I could be wrong too, so everybody listening, send your hate mail to Tony at Mason's House Los Angeles.
Gov.
But I think that the only difference was the dealer thing. I think that Keeley was, I don't know this for a fact, but if what you say is true and he was working through a dealer network, maybe that was the difference, because they started out, to me, the same, where they were both pedal mod guys.
Yeah, they did. But remember, Keeley also had his own pedals, too. I mean, Analog Man did, too. Like, he had the Sunface and stuff like that were, like, early pedals. But Keeley had the compressors and stuff like that also, the Katana.
And Analog Man had his compressor, too. He had a Ross clone. They were, like, the same, man. I mean, I don't know. Maybe, we're talking... If one followed the other, we're talking about, like, months or a year. We're not... But they seemed to me early on neck and neck, and then they divided into more of a... Keeley went the manufactured route, kind of more volume, and Analog Man just stayed small, and he's letting those kings of tone be super expensive, and he's fine with that. Wait 3 years, no problem. I'm going to sit here and wire them and whatever.
Right. No, I think that they both have their merits for sure, and I think that their business models just kind of became fundamentally different from each other. But what about like the second wave? They kind of get into a little bit with like they talk about Love Tone, Zvex, Fran Tone. I mean, I think some of these could even still kind of be considered first wave in a way. We talked about Analog Man, Keeley. Catlin Bread was mentioned as sort of like a prominent turn of the Millennium company. I felt like they became more prominent later than that, but I don't know if you have a read on that.
I certainly don't put them in the same wave as Zvex. That's definitely not true.
So who would you put in kind of the Zvex wave?
Well, good question. Zvex is almost their own thing, but I think Zvex came out kind of in the same... Remember we mentioned exotic pedals?
Yeah.
I think around that.
That's where I kind of feel like that was one company, as we mentioned a little bit last time, I thought needed a voice in this that did not have a voice in this. Like, I felt like their prominence relative to like what Full Tone was in 96 and like how in the late 90s and early 2000s, like Full Tone was inescapable on any like who's pedal board. I think exotic was that of the mid 2000s. Like,
yes, and
they were everywhere.
I have to press pause here because I'm realizing that I left out an important player in the first wave.
Okay.
Cesar Diaz.
Oh yeah, Tremdillo.
Yeah, the Tremodillo, the Squareface, and the Texas Ranger.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
And they were so quirky. I had one of his things. I worked at a shop where we sold some of his stuff, and that dude was a trip.
Oh, did you have to call him to like reorder stuff?
The boss would call him, but I would be there hearing, Like, I remember we got a Squareface that... Okay, so I want to say this with a lot of respect for Cesar Diaz, because I really like that guy. As just like an early, kind of a special weirdo in the space, And a great, like, his stuff was awesome. I love those pedals. I still get on Reverb every once in a while to see if anybody's got I want to get a Texas Ranger. Those were awesome. But those original ones, you'd get one and the knobs would be drilled a little off center. One is a little north of the other. And we had this square face where when you kicked it on, it was also doing like a sputtering tremolo thing. And Cesar my boss told him that he got a weird one that was doing this thing, and Cesar wanted him to send it back. And my boss was like, no, I'm not doing it. This is fun that it's like this. And Cesar was so pissed. He's like, no, don't sell it like that. Nah. And he was funny. But I had a Tremodillo from the original series, with his signature in it. I wish I never sold it. It sounded great.
Yeah, I love. I've definitely searched for them, and I think they're like $800 or something like that.
Yeah,
they're really expensive.
Yeah, but I will say this though: you don't really need one, but it was fun to have one, and you would have a field day with it because you plug it in and your tone just goes to garbage. Like, you'd have to buffer in and out and all that, because it was a tone sucker like crazy.
Well, I'm sure that there was easy resolutions for that.
Yeah, that's your gig, right?
Yeah. So we mentioned that's kind of going backwards a little bit. Going forward, so they kind of start around 2001. They mention Analog Man and Keeley. We kind of discussed them a little bit. And then they go to 2003. They talk about Catlin Bread. I don't know that I would say that was the iconic company for that era. I would certainly say Exotic in that era was the one.
Yeah.
Like, for sure. That's not to take away from Catlin Bread, but I feel like when Catlin Bread really got catapulted is when they did the Echoplex pedal.
Agreed.
Like,
Yeah,
I think
recent.
they had great pedals. Like, I remember what was it called? Like the Chili Picasso or something like that.
Oh, was that them?
Yeah,
Okay.
They had that, and they had another one that that a lot of people like called the Dirty Little Secret. That was kind of like a really nice Marshall-y style that I know a lot of people were into.
Yeah, but they weren't a player.
I thought that
they weren't a player in the space.
Well, I thought they were certainly among the boutique companies that were around at that time, and they were making stuff. But I feel like when they released that Echoplex pedal and then the Echo Rec pedal.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that those were collaborations with Jacques DeVille. I don't know if you remember. He also made pedals.
Yeah, I do remember.
Kind of during that time. Now he goes by Mr. Black, but in the early days, he was just called Jacques DeVille. And he made a couple of pedals. They were always black. You would see him. He was early on to like the hipster kind of like
Yes.
movement.
I do remember this.
He had a very specific vibe.
Yep.
And he made these clickless true bypass things too that were cool that you could install to have like a momentary switch in a relay to replace a mechanical true bypass. Remember, he sold those. He had like these kits. And then he also did a lot of side like engineering jobs for people. Like there was a time when Jacques DeVille, I think, was designed like a lot of the greatest hits of certain generations when the spin chips kind of first came into play. He was the guy that was designing a lot of those products that were really getting a lot of traction in the industry. And I think that he collaborated, my understanding is he collaborated with Catlin Bread on those to make those Bell Epoch and the Echo Rec pedal, which are fantastic pedals.
Yeah, so I will say this though, when we finally get to the contemporary era, that's
Right.
where I see Cattle and Bread. And I will say for Cattle and Bread that they're probably one of my favorite. If you just wanted to pick a company that's making quality stuff that I enjoy, they're doing great. And I don't even use a lot. We've talked about this a million times. I don't use effects really, but I do like them. And I think Cattle and Bread makes great stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I
agree. I think that they have a good mix of analog and like DSP or digital effects.
Yeah.
That they do a good job with.
But I've got a couple others for you in that mid line. When we're talking Exotic, we're talking Zvex, and this is just before the Line 6 era, right? Like
Well, I think Line 6 was out by then because the DL series came out, like the DL4 I think those came out when I was in high school. So that would have been...
Yeah, but Mason, those came out with models of Zvex pedals. So you know darn well Zvex was established by then.
Which ones had Zvex models?
They had the... It definitely did. The modulation... They had the trem, I think.
Yeah, so they were released in 99.
Yeah, Zvex was totally... I had a super hard-on from like 95.
And there was a super hard-on in
No, I'm saying I had a real Zvex.
Right.
In like the mid-90s.
Okay. Yeah, well then I know that some of their stuff was based on kind of classical established things, but
wait,
I wouldn't say
sorry, wait a minute. I take it back. Not 95, but earlier than Line 6 cuz Line 6 was modeling them. In the look at the the modulation ML.
Yeah,
MM4.
Yeah, I think it's MM4, yeah, let's see.
It's got one in there. It's got like a seek.
So what's the effect that
I think it's a seek trend.
The first thing that comes up when I look at it is to say that there's a fire hazard regarding a G10 relay transmitter that comes up on the Line 6 site. I was just caught off guard by that. So here's the settings that you have on the modulation. You have univibe, you have rotary, you have analog flanger, jet flanger, analog chorus, dimension chorus, tri-chorus, pitch vibrato, ring mod, panning, optical tremolo, bias tremolo, phaser, dual phaser, pan phaser.
Yeah. I don't know, but there's definitely... I know, because I remember the little... don't make me Google, man. I'm gonna be smarter, and I'm just actually gonna Google the question, right? So what Zvex modeled in Line 6? See, let's get right to it here. Let's see. I know, this is such great listening, right? But I must know. We'll get to the bottom of this.
It does say that Zvex was established in 95. You're right on that.
The Sequoia.
But which... That was on the mod?
I think so. I don't know, man. The internet's stupid. No, there's too much stuff about Line 6 because there's just too many things come up.
You know what? It might have been in the filter. It looks like the FM4.
Okay.
That's the purple one. And that one, yeah, it does. It has a seeker, which is based on the Zvex sequel.
There you go.
Yeah, there it is.
See, my memory does work sometimes.
You're one color in one category of pedal off.
So how big a nerd do you have to be to know that pedal was modeled in the other pedal? And I never owned either pedal, so I have no reason to know that, except I just happen to. That's some pedal nerdery right there.
That is, and so I think though the Line 6 thing I think is also certainly important and wasn't talked about the prominence of the I mean like a DL4 was the timeline of that generation, the Strymon timeline of that generation.
Remind me, because I have a question about DL4s in a minute, but that's a segue. So a couple more things about that period pre-Line 6 breakout. At some point, Hughes and Kettner makes a play.
Right, they have the rotosphere, which is cool.
And the tube factor.
Right. Yeah, that was used by like Jimmy Herring. I mean, a lot of guys used the rotosphere. Doyle Bramhall and...
Jeff Beck.
Did he use the rotosphere?
Still uses a rotosphere.
Still uses it. All right. Well, I mean, I have one. They're great. They're just not that easy to use.
Yeah, I like them too. You just let them be noisy. They sound great.
Yeah.
And the tube factor, is a secret weapon with a black panel fender. And you're right about Jimmy Herring. Also, for a while, Lee Ronaldo from Sonic Youth would use a super reverb with a tube factor, and it's interesting because that's the same thing that Jimmy Herring was doing for a while.
Yeah, I definitely know that they made a play. They had some great stuff, and also I think another thing too. I mean, they weren't that popular at the time, or not as popular as they've become. But Marshall released a lot of devices in the early to mid '90s as well, like that a lot of current pedals are based on.
Oh,
certainly the Blues Breaker.
Yeah, and the Shred Master.
And the Governor was or still is in a lot of ways. A lot of Marshall in the Box pedals are still based on the Governor.
Yeah, I really like the Governor if you want a distortion box.
It's excellent. I thought those are really great. I was surprised also there wasn't, and we mentioned this a little bit last time, there wasn't more talk about the Rat.
Yeah, not much talk about the Rat.
Or Proco generally.
We were talking. Oh yeah,
those guys are and those guys are the hometown heroes of Kalamazoo, Michigan.
Yeah. And did they talk about John Cusack?
No,
that's
they
another
didn't talk
guy
about John Cusack either.
From the
But he would have been more the mid. Was he pre-Line 6 though? I thought he was more like mid 2000s. Or early 2000s.
Man, you could be right. I'm getting a little out of my depth. The more we
here, I'm looking it up and seeing if there's anything about it on their story. But I also remember like he also got more into contract manufacturing. I'm just looking to see if there's anything about their story.
Oh, also in that period, Dave Fox.
Oh yeah, Fox Rocks. Yeah,
but he was working with Crest Audio. That was the beginning of the Fuzz Face reissues.
2002 is when Cusack started.
Yeah, so we had those happening, and the Fox Rocks was working the early Fuzz Face reissues, and then that turned into a Dunlop venture.
Yeah, well, I remember the Captain Coconut was a pedal that everybody wanted in the early 2000s. They had the Univibe and the Fuzz,
well, sure,
and all that stuff.
Are you hip to his Fuzz Faces though?
Yeah, he had a couple of them. One of them had like cards.
No,
there's the other one. There's like the.
No, you're talking about Fox Rocks.
Oh, you're talking about the Crest Audio.
Yeah,
stuff. Yeah. I know him.
Yeah, because that, and then that he was the one that first reissued Fuzz Faces at all. And he had the enclosures made and stuff, and then somehow that one, and this is all you can read about this on the Analog Man page. He has like an article about it, but then it pivots over, and Dunlop just grabs it up and runs with it because he just didn't stay in it, but
right. Well, that was a good move on Dunlop.
Boy, was it.
That was a good move.
A really good move.
I mean, they from a business strategic standpoint, like, grabbing up, getting Crybaby, getting Way Huge, getting MXR, like getting the Fuzz Face.
Yeah.
Like they own the majority of the market of classic vintage pedals that were not a part of their own brand to begin with, and absorbing them into their companies. I think it was a very smart move.
And then alongside of the Zvex in that period, there was Jacques Stomp boxes. Those started to show up.
Yeah.
And they were big hand-wired jobbies before they became what they are now.
Yeah, I think now it's like a real... Well, they're more budget-oriented, I think, now than they ever were.
Yeah,
but I still love the Meistersinger as a great chorus.
Yeah, and they used to be these hulking enclosures that he had. He wrote on them with a Sharpie, like volume, tone. Yeah, he had devices called like the Fuse Blower and all these great.
Yeah, I remember that one.
Yeah, and they were big, man. They were like Univibe size. Well, not Univibe.
Yeah, I remember he also had like really unique like stomp switches on him too.
Yes.
Where he had like these big stomp buttons on him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
He was the first guy that I saw with the input jacks. He was the first guy I saw use one plastic and one metal. for the in and out.
Right.
I don't understand it, but you probably do.
He's probably using a metal on the input jack to ground it to the enclosure, so he didn't have to add like a washer or something like that, or a spring to ground it to the enclosure. That's probably why.
Yeah.
At least my guess. So by mid-2000s, then they get into Earthquaker, although I don't know that I really noticed them as being as big in that at that particular time, but that could also be personal. They talked about Red Witch. They got into Wampler and JHS kind of around that time as well.
And this is where I think Cattle and Bread started to break out.
Yeah, this is what I would say. I would agree with that too. I certainly think of that generation, Wampler is probably the most prominent of that era. I think JHS, maybe even though it was established then, didn't really have its meteoric rise until a little later in the 2000s, like 2010 to 12 or so.
Yeah. By the way, I don't want to. There's something important that I don't want to gloss over here. The inclusion of Frantone in that kind of chapter before this.
Yeah.
I do in fact remember Frantone, and I remember them being excellent pedals. I feel like they made much in the documentary about that being kind of their effort to be inclusive of a woman who was building effects. I felt like that was part of the narrative. I never knew that about those pedals, and my question is, and we can put this out in the ether, see, it'll probably turn up in comments or something somewhere. I wonder what people think about that. Because my take on it is, I never knew that a woman was building those pedals. I thought the pedals were outstanding. They really, really were. And then this is a perfect kind of a case study for, did she not get the props she needed in the industry because she was a woman back then, is one question. Another question is, after the kind of Frantone never really became a guitarist's household word, are they now working too much to be inclusive because she's a woman? My argument is those pedals deserve a place in the pantheon. But I'm also curious, and I'm not even going to offer an opinion on anything else because I just think they were great pedals, and I was glad they got included. I just wonder what people's experience is of that in the modern day. Did that land on the viewer as a surprise? Like, well, I never heard of that. Like, I don't know what people say.
Well, I remember her pedals, and I had no idea that Frantone was Fran. I forget what her last name was. I'm looking it up here. Fran Blanche. I didn't know that she was a woman, but I knew I had experience with the pedals. I remember the Peach Fuzz.
Yes.
And yes. I remember what was the other one that I would get, the Vibratron.
Oh yeah,
those were two pedals.
So good.
Those are two pedals that I had experience with that would come to me. I think also the Hepcat too.
Didn't she have one with a baseball on it that was a good overdrive?
I don't know.
I feel like she had one with a picture of a baseball on it. I could be making that up.
I'm looking at her thing or her website here. I don't see anything that looks like that, but I would just say that I remember them being cool pedals.
Yeah.
And I didn't know that she was a woman at the helm. But I'll say that at the time that she was making pedals, and it says here she started in 94. At the time she was making pedals, there was a lot more interfacing with dealers because not a lot of people were. I mean, some people were selling direct, but if you wanted to have like more of an audience, you would find dealers who represented maybe a region. And so I'm sure that even though maybe, me and you as a customer maybe had no idea that she was a woman, the people that were sort of curating our choices were the dealerships.
Yes.
So depending on what their perspective was on Fran, that would color how everybody else, or just the access that she would have been given.
Now,
and so, I wouldn't have, I just remember them being cool pedals, and I remember like, oh, this is a cool boutique pedal. I had no idea who the maker was or the originator was. But again, some people were making that decision for me, because if it wasn't in my guitar store, the pervasiveness of online retail was not what it is now. And so...
Well, there wasn't online retail. It didn't exist. There was no online.
Right. Well, I mean, by then, or by the time I was in high school, which is when I was maybe like looking at this stuff, there was some.
1994?
Not like it is now. No, I was in high school in 94. I'm saying by the time I was in high school in buying, or interested in buying boutique pedals, that was, the late 1990s or early 2000s.
But what I'm saying is she started her company in 1994. So there was no internet. So this is why I'm asking my question. Because I think it's good to acknowledge outright a very big change in what the climate is like now versus then.
Right.
Because if you think about it, most musicians were pretty cool. Most musicians would be like, "Oh man, I don't care if it's a guy or a woman." But it was a big deal in the conservative business space at that time, and I think that could be lost on a young viewer of the documentary, what a big deal that is. You and me would never come face to face or even know who built a pedal. We would go to our local store, and if Fran had found a way to get her pedal in there, I might stumble upon it. Or if Guitar Player magazine or something wrote a review, then we would hear about it. But there are gatekeepers that maintained, I'm not trying to come off too political, or I'm not trying to come off as like some kind of overly woke person or whatever people say. But what I am saying is that I think this is a case study of a very real example where her pedals were every bit as good as a lot of the pedals that got a lot of exposure. And I wonder, I guess I'm putting it out there because I know that in the modern moment, there's a lot of pushback from some folks about, oh, of course, they've got to... I don't know about this movie, but in general, people say, oh, why do they got to signal this woke stuff and put a woman in it? It's like, no, because her pedals were dope back then. And if they are doing something to bring attention to that, I think that's a beautiful thing. So I just wanted to add that, that she earned her spot, and I didn't want to gloss over it.
Okay. Well, I think that it's an interesting conversation. I do think that there was a lot. I mean, I think that there's still gatekeeping going on now.
Oh yeah,
for brands and stuff.
Especially
like that.
Algorithmic, right? Like now it's all automated, like what do we see in our feed?
Sure. Yeah. Let's go. So we kind of talked about Earthquaker, a little bit about JHS. I think certainly of the mid 2000s, like Wampler has to be huge in there. Like, he kind of, he was all over the DIY community, had his published pedal book and all that stuff. And that certainly, I think, helped solidify him. The one thing that I thought was kind of interesting, and this is, I think the first guy to really introduce these two names was Wampler. He introduced R.G. Keane and Jack Orman, which are two guys that are kind of like the godfathers of sort of democratizing information around a lot of the common circuits, modifications, offering up their own interpretations of different types of distortion and overdrive circuits and things like that. The only real, like, sort of forefather of a lot of the guitar pedals that came into existence were maybe kind of pioneered maybe basic circuits from, that was actually like a person interviewed, was Craig Anderton. That was the only person that it was interesting to me that was kind of like a godfather of sort of the way that modern boutique pedals have kind of gone. He was the only person that was interviewed.
Yeah.
I would have loved to have heard from an R.G. Keane or from a Jack Orman, because those guys, their websites still kind of mirror sort of the primitiveness of an analog man, maybe even more primitive than that, because for the most part they're not really selling stuff, or maybe they're selling kits or things like that. But those guys were two really important people that I think, again, really democratized the DIY pedal world on internet forums and things like that. And so that people who are considering getting into pedals, or who were just getting into pedals, were able to have some facility without having to know a lot about reading schematics, without having to know a lot about like where to source parts from. And a lot of these online communities certainly created the Brian Wamplers and the JHSs and the Vertex effects of a lot of different pedal companies to come. And so I can't overstate how important those guys are for that purpose. And Anderton as well. I mean, hugely important in all that. And there really aren't, I mean, even a lot of the circuits that we use now even predate these guys. A lot of the circuits that we're using or are doing variations on, they are back to an application notes of a national semiconductor, like something that you can find in the back of a catalog, and so they were common ways to create distortion using these different parts. And so it's really interesting to me that those guys, I think, were really instrumental in sort of synthesizing a lot of the stuff that we were seeing in the 80s, in the 70s and 60s, and showing how to, they were really instrumental. And so I wish that there was a little bit more of them. And then they got into kind of maybe the more kind of modern era, and I guess you could consider JHS and Wampler in that as well, but they get into Walrus, and Maleco's in there, which I think predates them. Death by Audio, Alexander Pedals, Caroline Guitar Company.
And by the way, I would put Walrus, Death by Audio, Earthquaker in the same kind of. For me, that's all part of the same chapter. And maybe the rise of cattle and bread to being important is still in that same chapter. To me, I could be wrong.
And they mentioned Strymon. Thorpe pedals aren't utilized, but he's used as one of the kind of narrators for a certain point. Spaceman as well. Roger Smith from Source Audio.
Mm-hmm. There's there's an important thing about Dan Electro here too. Because
they mentioned Dan Electro shortly about like a resurgence of that budget oriented pedals.
But what I would say about Dan Electro is, because when they first came out with the reissue guitars, followed immediately by the pedals they came out with that were great, the Dan Echo and the Daddy-O Overdrive and those things. That was to me, that was an important moment in pedal history, because that was where they tried to harness the kitschy aesthetic of all of these boutique companies with a legacy brand, and they made an affordable, mass-produced, and unapologetically mass-produced thing with that kitsch, and said, here it is for cheap. And that was the first time we saw that. We had mass production, and then we had these kind of like dudes and Fran in their houses making pedals and having like kind of their own weirdo personalities, and then that grew as an industry. But Dan Electro is the one that said, but that vibe is also from now on going to be available as mass produced. So it was like an interesting twist in the industry there.
Yeah, I think they did that. I don't know where Behringer sits in parallel with that, because they also released a lot of kind of parallel, like inexpensive brand stuff.
And
then you could say,
but Dan Electro came up with their stuff was unique, their designs.
Well, I think maybe in the beginning, but I think what you see from Dan Electro now is certainly like, I think that they did like a clone of a Timmy and, like other sort of the time sort of stuff. And so I think that they were deciding what was commercially popular based on what had kind of struck a chord in the boutique industry, and then releasing products that sort of inexpensively replicated them, and I think that there's some version of that too at various low price points. Like you could say that Electro Harmonics has done that with a lot of devices like the Soul Food versus Klon and stuff like that, and created a $100 Klon or Joyo.
Yeah, but that's not
more.
That's not what Dan Electro was doing when they first came out with pedals. Those original designs, you pay big money for those. The Backtalk, the Sitar Swami, those are weirdo pedals that people pay like.
I know which ones you're talking about. I would agree. I would agree with it at that generation, but I think it deviated from that in subsequent generations of Dan Electro devices.
I agree with you. I'm just saying that first wave was an important moment. When you were there, like without knowing where it led, in that moment, it was like the industry, and it was a newer old, like a resurgence of an old company, but it was a new company. So they were saying, hey, here's your kitschy vibe for cheap, mass-produced in Korea.
I also mentioned in here, and I think that this is worth noting, I mentioned in our first episode that there wasn't really much reference to visual sound. I think visual sound was... They for a while had a vibe for sure. They had all those Jekyll and Hyde pedals and those kind of like home plate shaped, like double pedals.
Some of those pedals, dude, are so good that they should be like secret weapons for all kinds of players. And
absolutely,
I mean the liquid chorus, those pedals are fan-freaking-tastic.
I agree. And so I was surprised that they weren't mentioned more in kind of that 2000s, late 90s era, because they certainly had some really cool stuff. And then they kind of disappeared their pedals and went like completely with Walwart power supplies for a long time before kind of resurging with some other stuff.
You know what's weird, Mason, is I feel like what's his name? Is it Bob Weil?
Yeah.
He was an outsider even back then, because I remember his stuff, he marketed differently from the other. If you went to like Analog Man's website, which by the way, I don't think it's changed. It still looks like he's using like some kind of early. If you went to his website, or if you saw like Zvex's stuff, it was even if it wasn't deliberate, there was this kind of anarchy to it. This is like rock and roll noise, and they had that rock and roll stuff and pedals. It's a counterculture. It's a weird culture, weirdo stuff, funky stuff. And visual sound had this very wholesome, refined aesthetic. And he like Josh from JHS, I hope it's okay to say so, I think they're both in their private life and the way they conduct business kind of a very conservative, not conservative, I'm not talking about politics, but kind of old school, old time religion type dudes. I think that they don't try to be the bad boy. And Josh Scott has made it great because he's affable and fun and super smart, and he's got that great YouTube channel that's unprecedentedly great. But Bob Weil didn't have that. What he had, though, was just kind of this very straight-laced approach to pedals that didn't really have all that wackiness and kitsch. You know what I mean? Like, it was kind of just, this is an overdrive that will function for you on the gig quite well. It was kind of...
Yeah. Well, I remember my biggest remembrance of Bob Weil was in the early days of YouTube, and I think it was during a Nashville NAMM show.
You're talking about the shootout.
He had this shootout.
Yeah, that was bad.
And he had all these players, sitting in like a conference room.
Yeah.
And he had, these pedals behind curtains, and then he would and it was all done in real time,
Yeah.
And I remember, although I don't agree with all of his assessments, he had like this pragmatism.
Yep.
In this functional approach, which is like, I mean, again, I don't agree with him on this, but he's like, well, it doesn't matter if you have a 458, or 4558, op amp. It doesn't matter if you have, like he was kind of trying to do like a myth busting based on like what he believed to be common misconceptions that guitar players held, and then was using like this conference room at a Nashville NAMM show with all these players in the same room to kind of, do like a show of hands. Okay, how many people liked, what was behind curtain one?
So check this out. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Because what that video was, by the time that came out, he was already suffering the pushback from the cool guys. And I remember what this was like at the time, because his stuff was such high quality, but it wasn't marketing hip. It wasn't cool. And I felt, if you watch that video, and I haven't seen it in a long time, but I'll bet if we all watch it, I'll bet you'll see a bunch of like dudes that look like they're late night rockers sitting in those chairs with long curly hair, and I'll bet that he's standing there in a polo collared shirt like the one I've got on right now.
No, he always wears black. He always wears black shirts.
Okay, a black shirt like he's Bill Gates or something. Or is that the guy, or is it Steve Jobs that always wore the black?
Steve Jobs,
yeah. Right,
yeah.
Steve
He
Jobs.
always had a black shirt, and he always had kind of like his crew cut.
Yeah, crew cut and a black shirt. And he's up there, and what that was, Mason, I'm telling you, man, it was a pushback against the culture where he was like, yes, I'm the dork who's going to show you right now that my stuff is as good as the other stuff. So he had his overdrive up against the Klon, or at least the vintage Tube Screamer, I can't remember which.
Yeah.
And he was just showing them, look, that you cool guys cannot pick your stuff over mine.
Right. No, I think he had a lot of merit at the time. The other pedal company I wrote down here, I'm just like looking through my notes. They didn't talk much about Barkusberry, and that was another one, BBE, because they had a lot of kind of popular pedals at that time that were kind of lower budget. They had the Sonic Maximizer, and
as a rack device, that was a very important effect for a certain period of time. Mm-hmm. In the studio, that was a huge thing.
They didn't talk about Ross very much either in the early days of companies that were like making a lot of effects. They talked a little bit about DOD. Mm-hmm. And the other one, as far as like kind of prominent pedals right around the Catlin Bread time, that I think was equally, if not more popular at a certain point than Catlin Bread, was Love Pedal.
Yeah, those, I remember those. I would put those actually alongside of, Love Pedal. I was thinking
so he had
Tone.
like he had so he had the Cot 50.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah,
the Church of Tone. He had the Eternity was a pretty big one for a long time.
Les Louis or whatever, and he had the Kalamazoo that they did the Pro Guitar Shop shootout with the Klon, and that was a big deal.
Yeah. I mean, like Pro Guitar Shop made a lot of these, and they definitely got into that. And the other thing I thought, even though maybe it wasn't pedaled directly, Voodoo Lab was incredibly instrumental in power supplies that was ubiquitous. As many of those power supplies sold as any of the best-selling pedals of those generations. I thought that they were a very important player that was not mentioned. They also made pedals that were quite good.
I would recommend their Proctavia as a affordable Octavia type pedal. It's a great sounding pedal.
Chorus was great. Sparkle Drive was great. Tremolo was great. I mean, most of their stuff was pretty great.
Agreed.
We were one of the first companies that were making like a boutique era, like rack switchers and MIDI controllers, like foot controllers for racks.
People still use the Voodoo Lab power supplies, right?
Absolutely. And TC Electronic wasn't mentioned anywhere in here.
Yeah.
I think that they were very important too.
Yeah.
Because that informed a lot of future digital delays.
Yeah.
And then of course their own pedals that they had that were around, and Eventide was also not mentioned here.
That's crazy.
Also very important.
I would put them all the way back in the late 70s or early 80s as being really important.
Yeah, and the Lexicon also. I mean, like they didn't really do so much in the way of pedals, but a lot of the pedals were sort of derivative of a lot of those Lexicons, especially when Lexicon was absorbed by Digitech.
Yeah.
By
the way, you mentioned TC, also from Denmark. I think, isn't TC Electronic a Danish company?
Yeah. T-Rex.
I was going to say T-Rex was also important back then. Yeah,
they were huge for a while too. They had the replica was really popular.
I love that delay.
They had a bunch of popular stuff actually. They had an overdrive that was really popular. I can't remember.
The Molar or something, or they had the Alberta, which was like a tube screamer, I think.
Yeah.
They had.
What about the Timmy too? I think was a really important pedal that was like single builder, like old school boutique.
I'll tell you, man. That's one that I have zero experience with.
But I'm talking about just in terms of its prominence. I mean, like I remember it was really affordable. It was very boutique.
Yeah.
And like everybody either had a Tim or a Timmy, in a lot of ways still do. I mean, the fact that MXR bought, released a version of it, I think is kind of proof of the proof of concept that was a really great device that a lot of people connected with. Sonically.
Yeah, that's one of those that took off in Nashville. Nobles and the Timmy. I feel like the discussion boards really lit up with the Timmy when the gear page became a thing. And I think a lot of session guys in Nashville were using those, and I do remember that.
So let's finish out with what they said their last era was, and then, or they kind of categorized as the last era, which is kind of the DSP era, which was like, the Strymons of the world, Source Audio, companies like that.
Great interview.
Maris is in here a little bit.
Great interview with homeboy from Source Audio.
Oh yeah, man, he's a trip, man. He's great. He's really cool.
He's deep.
It's just funny, like, cause we didn't release the video, but like he's like in his backyard and there's like birds landing all over. Like
it's great.
it was very, very a natural setting, but it was cool. So I know that this is not the pedals that you gravitate towards, but certainly we're well into the prominence of really, high processing power, digital devices.
No, I can appreciate it.
And I think Strymon's certainly, on top of the world right now. They're kind of what Line 6 was in their generation of kind of being viewed as more boutique. Now they're kind of canonized as part of, now with the Yamaha buyout, they're kind of like on their own little echelon of pedals. But in the boutique realm, certainly Strymon is in the conversation there. I think Chase Bliss was mentioned quite a bit, although they're not doing DSP stuff. They're doing the analog, digitally controlled analog stuff.
Is that what that is? I didn't know that.
Yeah, and then Maris is mentioned in there. Those are all digital. And then Source Audio, those are all digital. But certainly all those companies are great. I think Source Audio is a little underrated because they don't have the same maybe like brand visibility as Strymon, but I think the algorithms are really great sounding.
That's cool.
This is not an area where I make any pedals that I have to contribute to the conversation, but I think that it's interesting if you look at the most popular pedals, Strymon and Maris, that were mentioned in kind of that category, or some of the most popular pedals. Those guys were all Line 6 guys, or Maris. Terry Burton was at Strymon through, I think, the Timeline, or maybe the Timeline and Mobius. He was there through kind of their biggest, kind of putting them on the map type products, and then migrated to his own thing in Maris. Source Audio, all those guys were Kurzweil or analog devices.
Oh, who we didn't mention is Alfonzo Harmaida.
Yeah, who I guess could also kind of possibly go in with the Love pedal because he sold some of his prominent devices or prominent designs to Love pedal, but he was big in the overdrive scene in the early to mid 2000s.
How does the Zen Drive compare the original with the modern Love tone produced ones?
Love pedal produced ones.
What did I say? Did I mix those up? I'm always mixing those up. Yeah, sorry. One of them Love pedals.
Yeah, he made the meatball.
Yeah, right.
It sounds just like
they're
the
so
meatball.
different too.
I think that they're close. I remember like showing them both to Robin Ford, and I think he thought they were close enough, for what they were. But obviously the guys who are like the real Zen Drive freaks are only going to want the original Zen Drive.
I mean, I played the Zen Drive just over at your place. I loved that. I thought that sounded great.
Yeah.
Just like a great pedal.
Yeah, I have an original one. I don't have a tube one, but I have the whatever the non-tube one is.
And then the Japanese clones of those, the Tanabe, the Dumb Kudo.
Oh, the Zen Kudo and the Dumb Kudo.
Kudo.
Yeah.
I kind of think those are cool, but I haven't played through one. I like the abalone.
Yeah. No, they look cool. I actually got to see one recently for Paul Jackson Jr. He had a Dumb Kudo, and so it was like the first, or Zen Kudo, I don't remember which one it was. But I haven't seen one in years, and so it was nice to see one in the flesh.
Landgraf. Landgraf belongs in there next to the Zvex and stuff, or the Analog Man.
Oh yeah, he was early on, but he didn't really do mods. He was just doing those swirl painted, like kind of tube screamer. One was called like the Dynamic Overdrive. Yeah. Is that right?
Something like that. Landgraf Dynamic or Professional. He was
there was like
another weirdo.
Yeah, and there's also Bob Sweet was kind of in there too a little bit with Sweet Sound.
Yeah, Sweet Sound. There's so many.
Yeah. I mean, I understand that they can't capture every single like small pedal company, in there. And I'm sure that some of the choices in terms of who to include or who not were probably predicated somewhat on availability, and then who was willing to be filmed, and then who was actually like intelligible on camera, because those are all different things.
Also, this was I
would have loved.
Sorry, don't mean to interrupt you. This was in production during COVID, so they eventually ran out of availability. They had.
I'm sure I would have loved to have heard from Roger Mayer.
Me too.
That would have been interesting. Or even Pete Cornish.
Yep.
I've tried to get in touch with him a few times, and the best I was able to do is he said that he would write, if I wanted to interview him, he would write the answers to the questions.
Oh, really?
And then I could narrate them to myself.
Oh, how interesting.
But I thought if it came to that, I need to get around to getting back in touch with him. But I think if I did that, I would just hire a voiceover actor that could represent a dramatic reenactment of Pete Cornish.
No, I think we do a video, you and me, and I will read as Cornish.
You'll read as Cornish?
It's the soft sustain. I made the soft sustain, gave it to David Gilmour.
We'll send you to a vocal coach. I got just the guy.
It makes it all fluffy. It makes the sound all fluffy. I don't need a coach. You ride, coach.
Is that a classic line of Pete Cornish?
Well, if Pete wants a different line, he's got to show his face, man. We're gonna do my Pete Cornish.
So if we're gonna wrap this up, what do you think? Final thoughts on the movie? Should people watch it? Do you recommend it? What do you think? Let's bring this to a close and give the people our final synthesis analysis of the video.
The more we talked about it, the more I like the movie. When I watched it, remember we started and I was saying it was kind of like watching a catalog?
Yeah.
I'm realizing now as we've discussed it that I have memories of all those times and all those pedals being released, and it means something to me. I would have preferred the story was told in a different way, which I described in part 1 of this. At the same time, the story does need to be told. And so I find myself coming around the other way and saying, yeah, if you're into pedals, watch this. It's kind of cool that there is a history beginning. And it's like the early guitar history books weren't perfect either, but if this is a first step, then I'm glad we were here for it. And I think if this is your era, you should watch it right now. I think so. I think it's worth the money too.
Yeah, I bought it because I wanted to support what they were doing, even though I didn't know the full content of what it was going to be.
Yeah.
But I'm in agreement that irrespective of who it's underwritten by, or if there's a reason for a Dunlop of the world to do it. My question, I guess, is at the same time is that who else has the budget to really support the production of a film like this? And arguably, it's one of the I'd say most established, strongest, longest running American pedal companies, which is Jim Dunlop. And so I don't know that it's a fault or a deficit, and maybe this could be looked at just the same as a service that they're allowing access and they're telling this story so that a wider audience maybe has a little more of an understanding of the background and where things are going. And I think that there's always going to be people to analyze or critique the choice of people. And, we had a few of those with, I think for me, it was like, I wish Voodoo Lab was in there. I wish that ADA was in there. I think that was a big miss, important one. I think Exotic, Visual Sound, Eventide, TC Electronic. But I think that you could cherry pick, stuff like that. And I think overall it does get across the timeline of pedals. It mentions a lot of the major players. I think that the narration throughout from Josh Scott was really strong. I think all their kind of guests that kind of help be the storyteller did a great job. I think it was well edited. Mm-hmm. And I think you'll be better off having watched it than not.
Yeah, if you're into pedals, I think so. I think that's fair.
Yeah.
If nothing else, you'll enjoy it. I think you'll enjoy it.
Any closing remarks before we conclude today, Tony?
No, I just really appreciate you bringing me on and us getting to shoot the breeze more often than we have been. It's nice.
Yeah, I agree. It's nice, and I'm glad that if the movie did nothing else, it brought two friends together to rap about guitar pedals.
That's right.
All right. Well, thanks, Tony. So that was The Pedal Movie in completion. Part 1 and Part 2 are both available for you if you want to go back and listen to Part 1, or you didn't even know that Part 1 existed. You can go back and check that out. Tony, I think, has a slightly different perspective than I do on this, and I think it's nice to have some disagreement or just to hear two people not completely align on the same thing, but in a polite and civil way, which is harder and harder to find here. So I appreciate that, and I think we both agree that this movie is good. It's important. There certainly isn't anything like it in our industry that's that well produced and had that much of a budget to work with. So I think that this is a good current high watermark for movies about pedals, and maybe there'll be some other cool stuff that'll come on the heels of this that might take it a little further and investigate it a little bit different way. But nevertheless, I'm happy with the results. I'm glad that it exists. And I'd love to hear from you about what your thoughts are, not only of our takes on it, but maybe what your take is on it. And you're always welcome to tag us on social media, and love to hear your perspective and where you think we might have missed the mark, where you think we maybe are right on, or where you completely diverge from any of the opinions that were shared here. So please do that if you haven't, and we'd love to connect with you on social media. I also want to thank everybody that makes this podcast possible. Hunter Harrison for editing and mixing the podcast, Mason Mejia for co-producing this podcast, and Tim Marco for creating all of the music. Until next time, I'm Mason Marangella, the Rig Doctor. Thank you again to Tony Lowe for co-hosting with me. Until next time, adios.